Question occurs on passage of F774 as amended. Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Aye.
Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Bekich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cowan. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Rono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran.
Reorder in the Senate.
Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden.
You are recorded no.
Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Baldwin, Baucus, Beckidge, Bennett, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Chiesa, Collins, Coons, Corker, Cowan, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Flake, Franken, Gillibrand, Graham, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Heller, Hirono, Hoban, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, McCain, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Rubio, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Grassley, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker.
Is there anyone in the chamber wishing to change their vote? Before the chair announces the vote, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate. The yeas on this bill are 68, the nays are 32. The bill as amended is passed. No. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander,